The wind had been cruel all week. It carried dust across the Wyoming plains like a gray veil, stinging the eyes, scratching the throat, and leaving a film of grit over everything in its path. Jacob Weller, the rancher most folks had long stopped talking about, stood at the edge of his barn that morning, squinting into the horizon. His ranch was a forgotten patch of land 50 miles from the nearest town, miles of fencing to mend, and too much silence for a man who had once known the laughter of family. He had risen before the sun, as he always did, feeding the cattle and checking the troughs, but something felt off. A sense, half instinct, half the prickling of loneliness, tugged at him. He couldn't explain it, only that the silence wasn't the ordinary kind he had grown used to. It was heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. When he pushed open the barn door, expecting the familiar smell of hay and manure, his boots froze on the threshold. Huddled in the shadows near the far corner, crouched against the bales of hay, were people. Not one or two, but 6. They looked like ghosts dressed in rags, faces drawn tight from hunger, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that animals have when they're cornered. For a long moment, no one moved. Jacob's hand, out of habit, rested near the rifle slung at his shoulder. His mind was a jumble of questions. How had they gotten here this far from town? Who were they? What did they want? He had been alone for so long that the sight of other souls, flesh and blood, felt unreal. One of the figures shifted forward. She was young, perhaps 20, though suffering had carved deeper lines into her face. Her lips were cracked, her hands trembling, but her voice carried clear enough when she spoke. "Please," she whispered, "shoot us fast. We can't bear pain anymore." The words were not said in defiance, nor in madness. They were spoken like a prayer, flat and final, as if death was the only kindness left in the world. Jacob had heard many sounds in his life, the wail of coyotes at night, the scream of wind through the rafters, the crash of cattle in a storm, but nothing struck him quite like those 6 words. His hand dropped from the rifle. For a second, he only stared at her, struggling to believe she meant it. But her eyes told the truth, eyes sunken from hunger, eyes that had seen too much cruelty to hold hope. The others behind her did not even lift their heads. They looked like they had been waiting to die. Jacob took a slow step forward, boots scuffing against the dirt floor. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The words came out awkwardly, almost foreign, because he hadn't spoken to another soul in months. The young woman flinched, as though safety were an idea she couldn't comprehend. Her shoulders tightened, bracing for betrayal. Jacob raised both hands, showing he held no weapon. He studied the group. 2 men, older but skeletal. A mother clutching a child who couldn't have been more than 6. Another boy barely in his teens, and the girl who had spoken. Their clothes were torn, their bodies shivering, though the barn was warm enough. "Hungry?" he asked. The child stirred faintly at the word, a reflex stronger than despair. The mother hushed him quickly, but Jacob had seen it. Hunger gnawed deeper than hopelessness. Without waiting for their answer, Jacob turned on his heel and walked back to the house. His heart pounded against his ribs. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only knew he couldn't ignore them. Loneliness had made him hard, but not blind. He thought of his own boy, gone too soon, and his wife who had never woken from that winter fever. If someone had found them then, starving for mercy, would he have wanted the same fate? Minutes later, he returned with a pot of leftover beans and a stack of tin bowls. The smell of food filled the barn. At first, no one moved. The refugees eyed the pot with the suspicion of animals who had been baited before. Jacob set the pot down gently in front of them. "Eat," he said simply. The silence stretched until the little boy, trembling, reached for a bowl. The mother tried to pull him back, but Jacob only nodded. The boy dipped a spoon, brought it to his lips, and the faintest sigh slipped out of him. That was all it took. The others followed, hands shaking, eyes filling as the taste of something warm and real spread through them. Jacob stood back, arms folded across his chest, watching them eat as though watching people step back into life. Their faces softened, color returning faintly beneath the grime. He had expected fear or suspicion to linger, but what he saw instead was a fragile, almost childlike relief. And yet, the words still echoed in his ears. Shoot us fast. We can't bear pain anymore. He knew this was only the beginning. Their bodies could be fed, but the wounds in their spirits ran deeper than hunger. He didn't yet know if he was ready to face what it meant to keep them here. But in that moment, one thing was certain. He would not raise a gun to them. For the first time in many years, Jacob Weller's barn had become more than a shelter for cattle. It had become a sanctuary for the broken. The barn had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Now it was the sound of spoons scraping tin, of shallow breaths between gulps of food, of the faint crackle of hay shifting as weak bodies adjusted their weight. To Jacob, it was a strange symphony life asserting itself, even in broken fragments. But the girl who had spoken, the one who had begged for death, sat apart from the others. She ate slower, her gaze never leaving Jacob. There was no gratitude in her eyes, not yet. Only suspicion, sharpened by pain, as if she expected him to snatch back his mercy at any second. When the pot was empty and the last spoon clattered to the ground, Jacob crouched down near her. His knees creaked, unused to bending for anyone but cattle. He studied her face more closely now, pale, smudged with dirt, eyes far older than her years. You said something, Jacob murmured, careful not to let the others hear. Something a person shouldn't say unless they've been dragged through hell. Her jaw tightened. For a moment she looked away, as though deciding whether he was even worth answering. Then, in a voice low and flat, she repeated it, almost word for word. We can't bear pain anymore. It's better to die fast than keep dying slow. The words were colder this time, not a plea but a verdict. She wasn't exaggerating. She meant it. Jacob felt his throat go dry. He had seen dying before his wife's breath rattling in the still air of their bedroom, his son's body limp after the accident in the stockyard. But this girl's tone carried something different, the exhaustion of the living who had already buried themselves in spirit. Who did this to you? He asked. Her eyes flickered toward the child, asleep now against his mother's chest, then back to him. The world. It was the only answer she gave, and the only one she seemed willing to give. Jacob leaned back on his heels. He wanted to press, but he recognized the wall in her gaze. It was the same wall he had built in himself for years, the wall that kept questions out and grief in. She wouldn't open it just because a stranger with a pot of beans asked her to. Still, her words gnawed at him. Better to die fast. He tried to picture himself in their place, empty-bellied, hunted maybe, carrying children through dust and cold, watching every promise of safety collapse. He didn't have to think hard. Loneliness had driven him to dark thoughts before, nights when the house echoed too loudly, nights when the silence pressed down like a weight. He had never spoken them aloud, but he knew how close despair could sit beside a man. Listen, he said, softer now, almost whispering back. I won't harm you. Not today, not tomorrow. You'll get food here, water, a bed of hay, if nothing else. She studied him, her suspicion shifting but not disappearing. Why? The question cut deeper than he expected. Why indeed? He could have sent them away, pretended he never saw them, locked the barn door and let the land swallow their bodies. No one in town would ever know. No one in town cared much about Jacob Weller anyway. Why? The answer rose unbidden. Because once, someone should have saved me, and no one did. But he didn't say that. He only shrugged, his voice rough. "Because a person's not meant to die begging." Her lips parted as if she might argue, but then she closed them, pressing them tight, until the cracks bled fresh. She turned away, curling her arms around her knees. For the first time, Jacob noticed how small she was beneath the layers of dirt and exhaustion. A girl, really, forced into hardness too early. He stood, letting the silence settle. The others were asleep now, curled into one another like a cluster of sparrows in a storm. Only she remained awake, her shoulders rigid, her body unwilling to let go of vigilance. At the barn door, Jacob paused and looked back. The lamplight cast her in shadow, but he could still see her eyes, glinting faintly in the dark. Eyes that had asked him for death, yet now flickered with something else, something not yet hope, but not despair either. It was a dangerous thing, he thought, to answer such a whisper with mercy, because mercy could turn into responsibility, and responsibility had a way of binding a man tighter than loneliness ever could. Jacob stepped out into the night, the chill cutting through his coat. He looked up at the stars scattered across the black sky. Once he had prayed under those stars, begged for answers that never came. Tonight, the whisper of a stranger echoed louder than the heavens. "Shoot us fast. We can't bear pain anymore." Rubbed his hands together, feeling the stiffness in his joints. Tomorrow, he'd have to decide what to do with them, whether to let them stay, whether he even had enough supplies to keep them alive. But for now, one thing was clear. There. The morning came harsh and unkind, as mornings on the high plains often did. Cold seeped through the wooden boards of the house, carrying with it the smell of dust and frost. Jacob Weller sat at the kitchen table, staring into a chipped coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The decision hung over him heavier than the ranch's sagging roof beams. What to do with the people in his barn. It wasn't just about charity. Charity was a loaf of bread offered at the church steps, $1, slipped into a stranger's hand. This 6 broken souls hiding on his land was different. To let them stay meant more mouths to feed, more bodies to clothe, more chance that his already thin supplies would vanish before winter's end. His own pantry was little more than jars of beans, sacks of flour, and whatever meat he could smoke from his cattle. It was enough for one man, maybe 2, but for 6? The practical side of him argued hard. He should point them toward town, tell them to find help there. Or more brutal, more honest, he could do what the girl had begged for and put them out of their misery. He'd seen men on the battlefield beg for a bullet when he was younger, serving in a war that no one remembered anymore. Mercy, some called it. But that kind of mercy left a stain on the soul. He rubbed a hand down his face, the bristles of his unshaven beard scratching his palm. The house was too quiet. It always was. Once upon a time, his wife would have been bustling around the stove, his boy rattling on about lessons or asking when they could ride out to mend fences. Now there was only silence, the kind that pressed into a man's bones until he almost welcomed the sound of his own weary breath. He stood abruptly, pushing back the chair, and walked to the barn. The sun had barely risen, and the land lay wrapped in a thin mist. His boots crunched on the frost-hardened dirt as he crossed the yard. Inside, the scene struck him like a punch to the gut. They were all still there. He half expected them to vanish like a dream in the night. The mother stirred first, eyes darting wide and fearful when she saw him. The boy beside her tightened his grip on her arm. The 2 older men shifted uneasily, their bodies tense, ready for rejection or worse, but it was the girl again who drew his gaze. She was awake, had been awake for some time. She sat against a bale of hay, arms wrapped around her knees, watching him approach. Her expression hadn't softened. If anything, it was harder now, as though she had already braced herself for his decision. Jacob stopped a few paces away, planting his boots firmly in the dirt. He rested his hands on his hips, the rifle slung at his back but untouched. "You can't stay here," he began. The words tasted bitter, but he forced them out. "This ranch barely keeps me alive, let alone 6 more." The girl's jaw tightened. She didn't look away. "But," Jacob continued, surprising even himself, "I won't turn you out with nothing. You'll eat, rest, and when you've got strength, we'll see where you can go." A ripple of relief passed through the group, so faint it might have been imagination. The mother's shoulders sagged, the boy relaxed slightly. One of the older men lowered his head into his hands. The girl, though, didn't flinch. "Why?" she asked again, her voice hoarse but steady. "Why help us at all?" Jacob hesitated. He could give her practical answers because leaving them to die would weigh on him, because he had food enough for a little while, because a man who lets suffering stand before him without lifting a hand isn't much of a man at all. But the truth clawed deeper than that. He remembered standing by his wife's bed, helpless, praying for anyone to come and save her. No one had. He remembered holding his boy's broken body, wishing desperately for a second chance. No one had given it, because no one saved me, he thought, and I can't let that be the end of it. "I reckon it's because you're here," he said finally, his voice gruff. "And I am too. That's reason enough." The girl studied him for a long time, as though searching for the catch, the hidden blade behind his words. Finding none, she looked away, but not before he caught the faintest crack in her armor. Not hope, not yet, but the smallest flicker of curiosity. Jacob straightened, looking around the barn. "There's work to do," he said. "If you're staying for now, you'll earn your keep. Fences need mending, stalls need cleaning. You'll eat better if you help me keep this place running." For the first time, one of the older men nodded, a flicker of pride in the gesture. The boy even sat up straighter, as though the promise of work meant the promise of belonging. Jacob turned back to the girl. She was still silent, still wary, but he saw her knuckles loosen against her knees just slightly. The choice had been made, not to kill, not to cast out. To let them stay at least for now. It wasn't the safest decision, and it certainly wasn't the easiest. But it was the only one he could live with. As he stepped back out into the pale morning light, Jacob felt something he hadn't in years, the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest, heavier than loneliness, sharper than grief. It scared him, but it also made him feel alive. The first full day with them was the longest Jacob had lived in years. It wasn't the work, he was used to the endless chores of the ranch. It was the sound. The quiet was no longer his own. For a decade, the silence had been steady, predictable, almost a companion. His days were marked by the thud of his boots on dry earth, the rattle of a feed bucket, the creak of old hinges. He spoke only to the cattle and the wind, sometimes not even to them. But now, in his barn, 6 strangers breathed, shifted, coughed, muttered, and sleep. That alone made the air feel different, unsettled. Jacob carried in water from the pump, setting down the bucket with a solid clank. The little boy was the first to dart forward, cupping his hands to drink before the mother scolded him gently. The older men drank slower, with deliberate care, as though each swallow might be their last. The girl, her name still unknown, took her share last. Her hands shook, but her eyes didn't waver from Jacob. He caught the challenge in them. "You gave us food, now water. But how long before the price comes due?" He didn't answer aloud. Instead, he grabbed a rag, wiped his brow, and said, "Got work to do outside. If any of you have strength, come with me." The 2 older men exchanged a glance, then pushed themselves up. Their limbs were stiff, their movements halting, but there was pride in the way they followed him out. The boy trailed behind, eager to help despite his mother's protests. Out at the fence line, Jacob handed them hammers and nails, showing them how to patch where the boards had warped. He didn't say much, just a nod here, a grunt there, but the rhythm of work filled the silence. For the first time, the strangers moved with purpose instead of despair. At midday, Jacob brought out bread and salted pork. They ate under the shade of the cottonwood, the boy gnawing happily, the men chewing slowly, savoring each bite. Jacob ate alongside them, and for a moment, it almost felt like the old days when ranch hands shared his table. But the barn was different. That evening, when he returned, carrying a pot of beans, the girl finally spoke beyond her plea for death. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice flat but edged with curiosity. "Jacob," he said. She nodded once, then looked away, as though testing how the name felt on her tongue. He waited, but she offered nothing in return. Not her name, not her story. Just silence. Later, after the meal, Jacob sat near the open barn door, the lantern casting a dim glow inside. He expected the strangers to collapse into sleep again, but instead, soft murmurs rose. The mother hummed to her child, a low tune that sounded more like a lullaby than a song. One of the men muttered in a language Jacob didn't understand. The boy whispered questions, his words tumbling fast, his mother shushing him gently. And then, unexpectedly, the girl spoke again. Not to him, but to the others. Her voice carried a story, something about a village, about rivers and fields, and a festival long ago. Her words painted pictures in the hay-scented dark, images of laughter and music, of days when their hands had been used for dancing instead of clinging to survival. Jacob listened in silence. The story was broken, halting, the girl pausing often as if searching for strength to continue. But it was enough. Enough to stir something in him that had lain dormant since his wife used to sing while she cooked, since his boy used to chatter about the stars. When the story ended, a hush settled again, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of despair. It was gentler, almost fragile. The girl caught Jacob watching her. For a moment, her guard slipped, and he saw not just the survivor hardened by suffering, but the faint outline of the girl. She might have been one who told stories around a fire, one who believed in futures. "Good night," Jacob said, surprising himself. The word felt foreign, awkward, but warm. The girl didn't answer, but her eyes softened. The mother whispered good night back. Even the boy echoed it shyly. Jacob stepped outside, the night crisp and alive with crickets. He looked toward his house, the windows dark, the rooms inside empty and waiting. But for the first time in years, he didn't dread going back to them. Something had shifted. The silence he had carried for so long was no longer unbroken. And though part of him feared what that meant, responsibility, risk, the tearing open of old wounds, another part of him clung to it. Inside the barn, voices had stirred. And inside Jacob, for the first time in years, something like life had answered back. The next few days settled into a rhythm, though it was a fragile one, like walking on ice that could crack at any step. Jacob fed them, gave them tasks, and tried to treat them as he might a crew of ranch hands. But he felt the barrier between them every hour. Trust didn't come easy. The older men worked, yes, but they did so with a stiffness that wasn't just from hunger. Jacob caught them glancing toward the horizon often, as though expecting someone or something to follow them. When he spoke, they responded with nods, but never with more than a few words. The boy was different. His eagerness outpaced his strength. He followed Jacob everywhere, peppering him with questions. "What's that tool for? How many cows do you have? Can I ride a horse someday?" His chatter was both exhausting and strangely comforting. Jacob found himself answering. Though his voice was rusty with disuse, the mother stayed in the barn most of the time, tending to the child. Her eyes carried a permanent caution. as though she'd been asked to give up too much already and couldn't risk giving away more. Whenever Jacob approached, she tensed. Her body angled between him and the boy in her arms. And then there was the girl, the one who had whispered for death. She worked hard when she chose to carrying water, mending stalls, sorting tools. But she also carried suspicion like armor. Jacob could feel her gaze on him whenever his back was turned, sharp and measuring. When their eyes met, hers hardened, a challenge he couldn't quite name. One evening, Jacob found her at the pump, struggling with the handle. He walked over, wordlessly taking hold and pushing down to draw the water up. She stepped back quickly, eyes narrowing. "I wasn't asking for help," she said. "Didn't say you were," Jacob replied. She crossed her arms, watching as he filled the bucket. "You could have sent us away. Why didn't you?" He had expected the question to fade after his first answer, but here it was again, sharper this time. "Already told you," Jacob said. "A person ain't meant to die begging." She frowned, as though unsatisfied. "Kindness has a cost. What's yours?" Jacob let the bucket brim before he straightened. "Work," he said simply. "I don't keep idlers." That seemed to irritate her more than reassure her. She muttered something under her breath, but he didn't press. He knew what mistrust looked like. It lived in her eyes the same way grief lived in his. Later that night, while Jacob sat by the barn door, the girl's voice rose again. This time she wasn't telling a story. She was warning the others. "He's feeding us now," she whispered, thinking Jacob couldn't hear. "But that doesn't mean he won't turn us in, or worse. Men don't give without taking back twice as much." The words stung more than he expected. He clenched his jaw, staring out at the starlit pasture, pretending not to hear. Trust wasn't going to come easy, but the ranch itself had a way of breaking down walls. The next morning, one of the older men collapsed in the field, his knees buckling under him. Jacob rushed over, hauling the man up without hesitation. "You're no good to me, half-dead," he muttered, helping him back to the barn. He cooked a stronger meal that night, meat stew instead of beans, and though no one thanked him, he saw the way their shoulders eased, the way the boy smiled through greasy lips. That smile alone softened something in Jacob. Still, the girls. Suspicion remained. She worked, she ate, but she kept her words sharp, her eyes sharper. Jacob didn't falter. Trust was a currency too often stolen and never repaid. But as he lay in his bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Jacob realized the truth. He didn't fully trust them either. He had let strangers into his barn, his food into their mouths. But he didn't know who they were, what they carried, or what danger might trail them. Trust, he thought, was a two-way road, and both sides were afraid to take the first step. Out in the barn, he could faintly hear the girl's voice again, speaking low to the others. This time, though, her words were softer. Not the sharp edge of warning, but the careful threads of a plan, how they might help mend more fences, how they might stretch the food longer, how they might not be a burden after all. Jacob turned on his side, closing his eyes. The road to trust was long, but perhaps, just perhaps, it had begun. The days grew colder. The wind had a sharper bite now, rattling the windows of Jacob's old house and whistling through the cracks in the barn. He'd patched what he could, but the ranch always seemed to be one storm away from collapsing. Still, the strangers stayed. And with every sunrise their presence dug deeper into his routine. It was dangerous, Jacob knew. Not just because of supplies or the risk of outsiders finding out. It was dangerous because of what it stirred inside him. At night, when the barn quieted and the cattle settled into sleep, Jacob dreamed again. For years his dreams had been blank, gray voids that matched his waking life. Now they came alive, cruel in their detail. He saw his wife, Anna, leaning against the stove, her hands busy with dough as sunlight warmed her hair. He saw his boy, Daniel, riding the fence line, his laugh echoing across the pasture. The memories weren't vague, they were sharp enough to cut. But then came the other images. The winter fever, Anna's skin damp with sweat, her lips whispering prayers he couldn't answer. Daniel's body crushed beneath a spooked steer, Jacob's own hands fumbling, useless as life slipped away. The dreams forced him to relive the moments he had buried, each night tearing open wounds that had only scabbed, never healed. One morning, shaken from such a dream, Jacob found himself staring at the girl as she worked. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, her hands red from hauling water in the cold. The set of her jaw, the determination in her movements, it struck him with painful familiarity. Anna had once carried herself the same way, strength hardening her softness. When times grew lean, he turned away, ashamed of the comparison. These people weren't his family. They couldn't be. Still, the ghosts followed him into every corner. While he repaired the barn roof, he heard Daniel's laughter and the boy who tagged along, asking endless questions. "Can I climb up there too? Do you think I'll be strong enough to hammer nails someday?" Jacob nearly barked at him to hush, but the boy's wide eyes stopped him. He swallowed the sharpness in his throat and answered, voice gentler than he intended. Later, as he watched the mother cradle her child, Jacob remembered Anna rocking Daniel by the fire. He remembered how her voice filled their little cabin with songs he never quite learned the words to. Now, when the refugee mother hummed softly at night, the sound tugged him back across years he had tried to forget. The hardest ghost, though, was silence. Once it had been his shield. Now it was broken, and every crack let memory seep in. One evening, after supper, Jacob lingered near the barn while the others settled. The girl caught him there, standing half in shadow. She studied him with those sharp eyes, always searching, always testing. "You look like you've lost something," she said suddenly. The words jolted him. He hadn't told them anything, not about Anna, not about Daniel, not about the years of loneliness. Yet here she was, naming it as if it were written on his face. Jacob's instinct was to snap back, to tell her it wasn't her business. But the weight of the ghosts pressed too heavily on him. He let out a long breath instead. "Not something," he said, his voice low. "Someone. Two someones." The girl didn't answer right away. She leaned against the post, arms folded, as though weighing whether to push further. Finally, she asked, "Did it break you?" Jacob almost laughed. A bitter sound, rough as gravel. "If I weren't broken, I wouldn't be talking to strangers in my barn, would I?" For the first time since they met, the girl's expression shifted. Not pity, he wouldn't have stomached that, but recognition. As though his ghosts had brushed against hers, and she understood. She nodded once, then turned away, her silence saying more than words could. That night, Jacob dreamed again. But it was different. The barn wasn't empty in the dream. It was filled with voices, with life, with people working and eating together. Anna and Daniel were there too, smiling, watching. And though the dream turned bitter, fading into the cold of morning, Jacob woke with a strange thought lodged in his chest. Perhaps the ghosts didn't come to haunt him. Perhaps they came to remind him he still had something left to give. The days stretched ahead, full of work and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob didn't dread it. Winter came slow to the plains, but when it came hard. Frost clung to the fence posts in the mornings, and the cattle's breath puffed out in white clouds. Jacob rose earlier, worked later, and every task felt heavier with the knowledge that 6 new souls depended on him. Yet strangely, the burden didn't crush him, it steadied him. As though the weight gave his days direction again, the strangers, though Jacob found himself less and less calling them that in his mind had begun to fold into the rhythm of the ranch. Not seamlessly, not without friction, but enough to change the air around the place. The older men proved useful with their hands. One had a knack for mending tools, making Jacob's battered collection stretch further. The other was steady with animals, calmer with the skittish calves than Jacob had been in years. Watching them work, Jacob realized they weren't just mouths to feed. They carried skills honed by survival. The boy grew bolder, running alongside Jacob when he rode out to check the far pasture. He begged for lessons, begged to sit in the saddle, begged to know the names of every piece of tack in the barn. Jacob resisted at first. Horses weren't toys, and ranch work wasn't for play, but eventually he swung the boy up in front of him, letting him grip the reins. The boy's laughter spilled into the cold air, bright enough to chase away some of Jacob's darker thoughts. The mother, quiet and cautious, began tending the kitchen. She stretched what little they had, turning scraps into meals that filled the barn with smells Jacob hadn't known in years. Once, she handed him a bowl and murmured, "Thank you." Just 2 words, soft as falling snow, but Jacob felt them settle in him like warmth, and the girl, always the hardest to reach, surprised him most. She worked without complaint now, splitting wood, hauling water, and once even taking a horse by the reins to lead it back when it slipped its tether. Jacob still caught the edge in her gaze, still heard the suspicion in her voice, but there was something else now too, a spark of determination, as though survival had shifted from resignation to defiance. One evening, Jacob sat by the fire in his house, staring at the worn photograph of Anna and Daniel he kept on the mantel. For years he'd looked at it with nothing but hollow ache. But that night, he found himself thinking not just of what he'd lost, but of the people out in the barn alive, fighting, working beside him. It didn't erase the ghosts, but it dulled the edge of their knives. The next day, the girl caught him off guard. "Why do you work so hard?" she asked as they hauled water together. Jacob wiped his brow, the cold biting at his skin. "Because work's what keeps the land alive. Work's what keeps us alive." She tilted her head, studying him. "And if we all stopped?" He looked at her then, meeting her sharp eyes. "Then we'd die. Simple as that. Ranch doesn't forgive idlers." She seemed to consider this, then nodded. For once, she didn't argue. That evening, after supper, she told another story, this time about a journey through mountains, about a night when snow nearly buried them and how they lit fires in caves to survive. The others listened, the boy wide-eyed, the mother humming approval. Even Jacob leaned against the post, letting the girl's words paint warmth against the cold barn walls. When she finished, Jacob caught her glance, and for the first time he saw not just suspicion there, but something gentler. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. The days continued like that. Small steps, barely noticeable until Jacob realized weeks had passed since the first night. The barn no longer felt like a shelter for strangers. It felt like the heart of a household. Work was shared, meals were shared, even silences were shared. Jacob found himself speaking more, his voice growing less foreign in his own ears. Found himself listening to the murmur of voices at night, to the laughter that sometimes slipped through. The silence that had once defined his life was no longer absolute. One morning, while leading the cattle to water, Jacob looked back toward the barn. He saw the boy carrying wood, the men repairing a trough, the mother hanging clothes to dry. And the girl, she was watching it all, her arms folded, her eyes steady, as though she had decided something important. Jacob felt a strange tug in his chest then, a mixture of fear and hope. These weren't just steps toward survival. They were steps toward living. And living, he knew, was far more dangerous than dying, because living meant hope. And hope meant something you could lose again. Snow came heavy one morning, laying a thick white blanket over the pastures. Jacob rose before dawn as usual, pulling on his boots and coat, But when he opened the door, the world was silent, muffled, under snow. Even the cattle seemed hushed, their shapes blurred in the drifts. He trudged to the barn, expecting the familiar creak of hinges and the smell of hay. But what greeted him was different. The barn wasn't silent, it was alive. The boy was laughing, chasing the little one in circles around the hay bales. One of the older men was mending a harness, humming low under his breath. The mother stirred a pot over a small fire pit Jacob had allowed them to set up inside the barn, steam curling into the rafters. And the girl, the one who once begged for death, was bent over a piece of scrap cloth, stitching carefully with a needle Jacob hadn't even remembered he owned. For a moment, Jacob stood in the doorway, snowflakes melting into his beard, just watching. It struck him then that the barn no longer looked like a shelter of desperation. It looked like a home. The girl noticed him first. She lifted her head, and instead of suspicion, her face softened with something new, acknowledgement. Not quite. A smile, but not the hard mask she usually wore. "You're up early," she said. Jacob chuckled. "Habit." She glanced back down at her stitching. "We're fixing clothes. Winter's not going to be kind." Jacob nodded, stepping inside. Winter's never kind, but we'll face it. The word we surprised even him. That evening, when supper was done, Jacob lingered in the barn with them instead of retreating to his empty house. The boy asked him questions about the stars, pointing through the cracks in the roof. Jacob found himself answering, teaching the boy which cluster was the Big Dipper, which one pointed north. Soon the mother joined in, humming softly to settle the little one, and the men leaned in to listen. The girl, silent as ever, watched Jacob with sharp eyes, but this time the sharpness wasn't suspicion. It was attention. Then she began to sing. It wasn't loud or polished, just a quiet tune, in a language Jacob didn't know. The notes were steady, low, and carried something deep with them. Sorrow, yes, but also endurance. The barn filled with the sound, wrapping around the beams, softening the edges of the night. Jacob closed his eyes. For years his house had known only silence. Now here he was, surrounded by voices, by warmth. And it hurt, in a way, because it reminded him of Anna's songs and Daniel's laughter. But it healed too. Over the next weeks, they found more of this rhythm. The boy worked beside Jacob daily, learning to tie knots and carry tools. The older men repaired fences Jacob had given up on years ago, restoring order to the land. The mother took over cooking entirely, turning even scraps into meals that tasted of care. And the girl, she became the quiet leader. She organized chores, encouraged the others, and began speaking more openly. She was still sharp, still wary. But when Jacob saw her guiding the boy's hands as he tried to stitch a tear in his coat, or when she crouched to comfort the little one in the middle of the night, he realized something. She had stepped into a role bigger than survival. She had become the anchor. One night, as the snow piled high outside and the barn glowed with lamplight, the girl sat across from Jacob. "You've given us more than food," she said. Her voice was steady, not a whisper of despair this time, but a statement of fact. "You've given us a chance." Jacob shifted uncomfortably, not knowing what to say. Compliments felt strange on his shoulders. "I just gave you work, that's all." She shook her head. "No, work is what makes us live. Without it, we'd still be waiting to die." For the first time, Jacob let himself smile. It was faint but real. That night, as he lay in his own bed, he realized something had changed. The people in his barn weren't strangers anymore. They weren't just mouths to feed or hands to put to use. They had become something else, something he hadn't dared hope for in years. They were a family. Not by blood, but by survival, by shared meals, by the rhythm of work and rest and voices in the dark. And Jacob. The lonely rancher who once lived only with ghosts found himself no longer alone. The snow finally eased, though the world outside the barn remained buried in white. Winter was always hardest on a ranch, but this year felt different. Work didn't just fall on Jacob's shoulders, it was shared. And in the sharing something, inside him shifted. The boy had taken to shadowing him from dawn until dusk. Jacob taught him to tie knots, to carry wood properly, even how to check the cattle for signs of frostbite. The boy listened with a fierce attention, his eyes shining each time Jacob praised him. "Good job, son," Jacob almost said once, but the word stuck in his throat. He wasn't Daniel. Still, the warmth lingered in his chest, and he let it. The older men grew stronger with each passing day. Their hands, once trembling with hunger, now worked steady and sure. They cut wood in clean strokes, patched fences with skill, and drove the cattle with a kind of patience only hard men learn. Jacob caught himself trusting them more, not watching over his shoulder so much. The mother, though quiet, transformed the barn into something closer to a home. She kept the fire lit, the clothes mended, and the little one wrapped tight against the cold. Her soft hums at night filled the silence in ways Jacob had thought he'd never hear again. More than once, he lingered outside the barn just to listen. Before heading back to his own house, and the girl, she had changed most of all. The hard edge was still there. Jacob doubted it would ever fully leave, but it had softened around the corners. She worked harder than anyone, often taking the heaviest loads. She directed the others with quiet authority, her words steady, her presence grounding. And when she spoke to Jacob now, it wasn't always with suspicion. Sometimes it was with curiosity. One evening, as they hauled water back from the frozen pump, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of it?" "This life?" Jacob wiped frost from his beard. "Every damn day." "Then why keep at it?" He looked at her, at the determination in her eyes, the way she carried burdens twice her size. "Because the land don't care about tired. You stop, you lose it. You work, you live." She nodded slowly, as if weighing his words, then said, "That's not so different from us." Jacob didn't answer, but he felt her meaning. They'd been forced to keep going long after their strength was gone. Now, for the first time, they were working for something beyond survival. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It was about belonging. That truth struck Jacob harder than he expected. He'd lived years with only ghosts, convinced nothing new could take root in the ashes. Yet here they were, planting themselves into his life, into his land, into his heart. One night, after supper, the girl surprised him again. She stood before the others and said, "We should do more than just survive. We should plan, plant, prepare for spring." Jacob studied her. Her voice wasn't desperate, it was strong, filled with a kind of fire he hadn't heard in years. She spoke of seeds, of mending the soil, of raising enough food not just for today but for tomorrow. The others nodded, even the boy grinning at the thought of planting rows of beans and corn. Jacob felt something swell inside him, something dangerously close to pride. Later, when the barn had quieted, the girl sat beside him at the door, both of them staring out into the dark. "You gave us more than food," she said, echoing her. Words from weeks before. "You gave us work, and work gave us hope." Jacob shifted, uncomfortable with praise. "You gave it to yourselves. I just handed you a shovel." She smiled faintly, the closest thing to warmth he'd seen from her. Sometimes that's all a person needs, a shovel, a chance. Jacob said nothing, but he thought of Anna, who had once said nearly the same thing, that survival wasn't enough, that living meant planting, building, loving. He thought of Daniel, whose laughter had filled these pastures, whose hands had once helped mend these fences. And for the first time, the memories didn't feel like daggers. They felt like guides. The ghosts had haunted him, yes, But now they seemed to walk beside him, nodding in approval as he worked, as he opened his heart again to people who needed him. Redemption didn't come in grand gestures. It came in mended fences and hot meals, in a boy's laughter and a girl's steady gaze. It came in the slow, relentless work of choosing life each day. Jacob realized he wasn't just keeping them alive. They were keeping him alive too. Spring came late to the plains, but when it finally arrived, it came in a rush of green. Snow melted into the thirsty earth, creeks swelled, and the first stubborn shoots of grass pushed through the thaw. Jacob stood at the edge of his field, shovel in hand, watching the others move across the land that had once felt like his alone. The boy ran ahead, dragging a sack of seed, his laughter bright against the open sky. The older men worked methodically, tilling rows with tools Jacob had almost given up on years ago. The mother spread out blankets to dry, the little one giggling as she tried to catch the wind in her hands. And the girl walked the line of the field with Jacob, planting beside him, her movements steady and sure. Jacob's land had seen many seasons. It had seen loss, silence, grief. But now, as the sun rose higher, it saw something else. Life being built, not abandoned. "Never thought I'd see this again," Jacob muttered, pressing his boot against the shovel to break the soil. The girl glanced at him. "What?" "Hope," he said simply. She didn't answer right away. She just kept planting, her fingers pressing seed into earth. Finally she whispered, "We thought hope was gone. That night in your barn, we only wanted an end. Now?" She looked across the field where the boy was chasing the wind. "Now it feels like the beginning." Jacob nodded, his throat tight. The days lengthened, the work grew heavier, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like purpose. Fences stood straight, cattle grazed on fresh grass, and rows of green pushed through the soil. Each evening, when the sun dipped low, they gathered together, not just to eat, but to talk, to share stories, to plan. The barn rang with laughter, with voices, with songs and languages Jacob didn't know but came to love anyway. One night after supper, the boy asked Jacob, "Can I stay here forever?" The question struck Jacob harder than he expected. He looked at the boy's eager eyes, at the mother watching quietly, at the girl's guarded expression. For years he'd lived as though his ranch were a graveyard, the land a monument to what he had lost. But now, with these people woven into its daily rhythm, it no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a home. "Yes," Jacob said finally, his voice rough. "Yes, you can." The boy grinned, leaping into his mother's arms. The girl's gaze met Jacob's across the table, and for once there was no hardness in it, only gratitude. Weeks passed, and the ranch bloomed with life. The boy grew stronger, the men steadier, the mother brighter, the little one full of mischief. And the girl, her shoulders, once weighed down by despair, carried hope now. She smiled more, worked with a kind of determination that no longer sprang from survival alone, but from the promise of tomorrow. Jacob often caught himself staring at them all, a quiet awe filling his chest. He had thought his story was over, that his days would end in silence. Yet here he was, watching a new chapter unfold. The memory of that first night never left him, the whisper, "Shoot us fast, we can't bear pain anymore." But now it stood in stark contrast to what he saw before him. Those words, born of despair, had given way to something stronger. The choice to live, to work, to build. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, Jacob stood with the girl at the fence line. They watched the cattle graze, the boy running through the tall grass, the mother rocking the little one on the porch of the barn. "You saved us," the girl said softly. Jacob shook his head. "No, you saved yourselves. I just gave you a place to do it." She studied him, then smiled an honest, unguarded smile. Sometimes a place is all a person needs. The wind stirred the grass, carrying the scent of earth, the sound of laughter, the promise of seasons yet to come. For the first time in years, Jacob let himself believe in tomorrow. Not as something to dread, but as something to build. The ranch was no longer a grave dot, it was a future.